The sun was setting behind the hills, casting an amber glow through the windows, enveloping the house in a soft, tranquil light. The familiar hum of the kitchen filled the air as I prepared dinner, accompanied by the faint background sound of the radio. Everything felt ordinary, peaceful, a weekend like any other. Except it wasn't. Leo, my 21-year-old son, had come home from college, and the house was filled with the quiet excitement that always accompanied his visits. I could hear him rummaging through the fridge as he settled back into the familiar rhythms of home life. It struck me then how much had changed. Just a few years ago, he was a little boy following me everywhere, his voice filled with endless curiosity. Now he stood tall, with broad shoulders and a confidence that came from living away, forming his own life. He had become a man I was still getting used to seeing instead of the boy I had raised. "Dinner's ready," I called from the kitchen. Leo appeared, a soft smile playing on his lips, and took a seat at the dining table. I sat across from him, noticing the subtle shift in his posture. There was something different about the way he looked at me. His gaze lingered just a second too long, enough to make me pause, though I quickly dismissed it as nothing. "So," I asked casually, "how's school been?" "It's good," Leo replied, but his voice carried a tone that seemed deeper, more thoughtful than I remembered. I missed this, being home. We chatted about his classes, his friends, and the things he had been up to recently. His words were light, but there was a strange undercurrent to his tone, something I couldn't quite place. As he spoke, I noticed his eyes following me, not with the casualness of a son speaking to his mother, but with a focus that felt different. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just my imagination. He was probably just tired. Here we finished dinner, and as I cleared the plates, I felt a small knot forming in my chest, a subtle unease I couldn't explain. It wasn't the conversation itself, it was the way he looked at me, the way his voice carried something unsaid. "I'll want to watch a movie?" Leo suggested, his smile warm and familiar, just like old times. "Sure," I agreed, eager to recreate the moments we used to share before college took him away. We settled into the living room, the dim lighting creating a cozy atmosphere. I found myself relaxing as we picked an old movie we used to love. For a while, everything felt normal again, and I allowed myself to enjoy the moment. Yet every now and then I would glance at him, at how much he had grown, at the way he now occupied the space around him differently, with a quiet confidence I wasn't used to. And just as I started to think that maybe things were as they always had been, his hand brushed against mine, a small, fleeting touch. But it wasn't just a touch. It was like an electric shock, unexpected, sharp, and unsettling. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly pulled my hand away, hoping he hadn't noticed my reaction. And Leo turned to me, a hint of concern in his voice. "Mom, are you okay?" I forced a smile, trying to dismiss the moment even as my pulse raced. "I'm fine, sweetie. Just tired." I tried to focus on the movie, but every now and then I found myself glancing at him. I noticed the way his jawline had sharpened, the way his hands rested on his lap, strong, sure, no longer fidgety like they used to be. It was unsettling, this awareness of him not as just my son but as an adult. I told myself it was just because I hadn't seen him in a while, that I was still adjusting to how quickly he had grown up. His hand brushed against mine light. Accidental, or so I thought at first. But the moment our skin touched, a spark shot through me. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but powerful enough to make my breath hitch. My heart began to race, and I pulled my hand away, pretending to adjust the blanket draped across my lap. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Leo glance at me. "Mom, you okay?" His voice was soft, concerned, yet there was something beneath it, something I couldn't quite name. I forced a smile, my heart pounding in my chest. "I'm fine, sweetie. Just a little tired." He nodded, but I could feel his gaze lingering on me, studying me in a way that made my skin prickle. I shifted slightly, creating a bit more space between us, but the air in the room felt heavy, thick with something unspoken. The movie droned on in the background, but neither of us was paying attention anymore. I tried to focus on the screen, but my mind was spinning, caught up in the strange, electric tension between us. It wasn't just the touch, it was the way he looked at me, the subtle shift in his body language, the way the air around us seemed charged with something I didn't want to acknowledge. I told myself it was nothing. I was just overthinking things. He was my son, and I was his mother. That was all there was to it. But deep down, I knew that whatever had just happened on the sofa, whatever had flickered between us in that brief moment of contact, was something I couldn't simply ignore. The rest of the movie passed in silence. Leo didn't touch me again, but the weight of that moment hung between us, unspoken yet undeniable. When the credits finally rolled, I stood up quickly, smoothing my clothes as if I could brush away the lingering tension along with the wrinkles. "I think I'll head to bed," I said, my voice strained but steady enough to pass for casual. "It's been a long day." Leo looked up at me, his expression unreadable. For a moment I thought he might say something, acknowledge the moment we had shared, ask me what it meant. But instead he just nodded. "Okay, good night, Mom." "Good night," I whispered, turning away before he could see the confusion and unease written on my face. As I climbed the stairs to my room, my heart still raced and my mind buzzed with unanswered questions. I told myself that it was just a fleeting moment, an accident, nothing more. But as I lay in bed night, staring at the ceiling, I knew the truth. Something had shifted between us. A line had been blurred, a boundary crossed, even if only in the smallest, most innocent way. The next morning was unusually bright. Crisp autumn air flowed in through the open kitchen window, carrying the scent of leaves and soil. I stood by the counter, nursing a cup of coffee, lost in my thoughts from the previous night. I kept telling myself that what had happened on the sofa was nothing, just a fleeting moment, a misunderstanding between a mother and her grown son. But the strange weight in my chest refused to lift. Leo walked in, looking rested and casual, as if nothing unusual had happened. "Morning, Mom," he said with an easy smile, as if the world hadn't shifted the night before. "Morning," I replied, forcing a smile, though my heart remained uneasy. After a brief silence, Leo leaned against the counter and suggested, "Hey, I was thinking of going for a hike later. I want to come with me, like old times." The words made me pause. It had been years since we'd walked the trail together, since the days when he was small and full of energy, racing ahead of me on the path, laughing under the sun. The idea tugged at my heart in a nostalgic way, yet the unease from last night still lingered. For a moment I considered making an excuse. Maybe it was better to keep some distance, let things settle on their own. But then I thought, he's my son. There's no harm in spending time with him. I needed to prove to myself that things were still normal. "Sure," I said, a little more cheerfully than I felt. "That sounds nice." We drove out to the trail later that afternoon, the silence between us feeling both familiar and foreign. The sky was a deep, cloudless blue, and the trees swayed gently in the cool breeze. I tried to focus on the present, to shake off the lingering tension that clung to me. As we started walking along the path, Leo slipped into his usual rhythm, chatting easily about school, his friends, and plans for the future. His voice was light, and for a while I allowed myself to relax. The trail was just as I remembered, winding through the forest, leading to a clearing with a breathtaking view of the valley below. It felt like stepping into the past, into a simpler time when things were easier between us. For a while we walked in comfortable silence, both of us lost in our thoughts. Then, as we reached the familiar clearing, Leo stopped and looked out over the valley. The light breeze ruffled his hair, and for a moment he seemed younger, like the boy he used to be. But when he turned to me, the boy I remembered was gone. There was something in his eyes, something deeper, rawer. "You've always been there for me, Mom," Leo said, his voice soft but serious. "I don't know what I'd do without you." The words hit me harder than they should have. There was an ache in his voice, a vulnerability that made my heart twist painfully in my chest. I tried to keep things light, offering him a gentle smile. "Well, you won't have to find out anytime soon. I'm not going anywhere." But Leo didn't laugh. Instead, he stepped closer, closing the space between us. His gaze locked onto mine, and the intensity in his eyes made my breath catch. "No, I mean it," he whispered. "You're not just my mom. You've been everything to me." The weight of his words hung heavily in the air between us. I stared at him, my heart racing, searching his face for some hint that this was just an innocent moment of affection, a passing sentiment. But the look in his eyes told me otherwise. My stomach knotted as I realized what he was trying to say, what he had been holding back for so long. This wasn't just love between a mother and her son. This was something far more complicated, something neither of us was prepared for. "Leo," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the breeze. "You know how much I love you, right?" He nodded, his expression both earnest and conflicted. "I love you too, Mom, more than you realize." Panic surged through me, sharp and overwhelming. This wasn't how things were supposed to be. This wasn't a conversation I ever thought I'd have. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. I think we should head back. It's getting late. But before I could turn away, Leo reached out and gently took my hand. His touch was light, almost hesitant, but the way his thumb brushed against my skin sent a shiver down my spine. Mom," he said softly, his voice laced with something I couldn't name. I don't know how to say this, but I've been feeling something I know I shouldn't. And I think you feel it too." His words shattered whatever composure I had left. I pulled my hand away, taking a step back, my pulse roaring in my ears. "Leo, stop," I whispered, my voice trembling. "You don't mean that. You're confused." He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and hurt. "I'm not confused, Mom. I know how I feel." "No," I said, shaking my head, my voice breaking. "This isn't right. You're my son. We can't." The words felt too dangerous, too heavy to finish. Leo's shoulders slumped, defeat and sorrow clouding his face. "I know," he whispered. "I know it's not right, but I can't help it. And I don't think you can either." Tears welled in my eyes, the weight of the situation crashing down on me. I had to stop this before it went any further, before we crossed a line that we could never uncross. "I'm your mother," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I love you, but not like that. We can't do this." The silence between us was suffocating, heavy with emotions that neither of us knew how to handle. I saw the pain in Leo's eyes, the way his expression crumbled under the weight of rejection. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." I swallowed hard, trying to push down the overwhelming emotions swirling inside me. "It's okay," I said softly, "though nothing about this felt okay. Let's just go home." Leo nodded slowly, and we turned back toward the car, the heavy silence following us every step of the way. The drive back home was suffocatingly quiet. Leo sat beside me, close yet feeling miles away, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. I gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, trying to focus on the winding path before me, but my mind was spinning with everything that had happened on the trail. What had gone wrong? When had we crossed that invisible boundary between affection and something more? I couldn't stop replaying his words, "You've been everything to me." The way his eyes had softened, the way his voice had trembled with emotions neither of us had dared name out loud. I glanced at Leo from the corner of my eye. He sat rigidly, his hands resting on his thighs, the silence between us as heavy as the overcast sky pressing down on the forest around us. I wanted to say something, anything, to break the tension, but every word that came to mind felt too dangerous. Leo's confession still clung to me like a second skin, and with every mile we drove, I felt myself sinking deeper into a haze of confusion and guilt. I knew what I had to do, set things right, re-establish the boundaries between us. Yet the memory of his touch, the way his thumb brushed over my hand, haunted me. How had something so small felt so intimate, so wrong? When we finally pulled into the driveway, the tension between us remained thick and unbroken. Leo shifted uncomfortably in his seat, as if waiting for me to say something to give him an answer to the questions neither of us wanted to ask, but I couldn't. "I think I'll head to my room," Leo murmured, his voice low and uncertain. I gave a stiff nod, still gripping the wheel as if it were the only thing tethering me to reality. "Okay," I whispered. "Good night." He hesitated for a moment longer, his eyes flickering with emotions I couldn't quite read. Then, without another word, he climbed out of the car and disappeared into the house, leaving me alone with the silence and my swirling thoughts. I sat in the car for several minutes, staring blankly at the dashboard, trying to steady my breathing. I felt like I had been plunged into deep water, unable to find the surface. What had started as an innocent hike had unraveled into something far more complex, something that neither of us had been prepared for. When I finally forced myself out of the car, the house felt colder and emptier than it had in years. I sank onto the sofa, wrapping my arms around myself, trying to ward off the chill that had settled deep in my bones. But no amount of warmth could shake the feeling that something irreversible had changed between Leo and me. At night, sleep refused to come. I lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts tangled in a web of emotions I couldn't unravel. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Leo's face, his expression torn between love and confusion, his voice whispering words I wasn't ready to hear. I knew I couldn't avoid him forever. We had to talk, we had to confront what had happened, no matter how difficult or painful it might be. But how could I set things right without breaking his heart? How could I reassure him without crossing a line that had already become dangerously blurred? Just as I was beginning to drift into restless sleep, a soft knock echoed through the door. My heart leaped into my throat, and I sat up abruptly, pulling the blanket tighter around me. "Mom?" Leo's voice was quiet, hesitant, as if he wasn't sure he was welcome. "Can I come in?" Every instinct told me to say no, to keep the door between us closed, but I couldn't bring myself to shut him out. Not like this. "Come in," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The door creaked open and Leo stepped inside, his expression a mix of guilt and longing. He hovered at the edge of the room, looking lost and unsure, as if he didn't know where to go from here. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice thick with regret. "I didn't mean to. I didn't want to make things weird." I swallowed hard, my throat tight with unshed tears. "I know, sweetie," I whispered. It's okay. We just got a little lost today, didn't we?" Leo nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I don't know what's wrong with me," he admitted quietly. "I know it's not supposed to feel like this, but I can't stop. I've tried, Mom. I really have." The raw vulnerability in his voice shattered the last of my resolve. I wanted so badly to reach out to comfort him the way I used to when he was a child, to tell him that everything would be okay. But I couldn't. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. "Leo," I whispered, leaning forward slightly. "What you're feeling, it's not wrong to feel confused. But we have to be careful. We have to remember who we are to each other." He looked up at me, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. I know you're my mom. I don't know how to stop feeling like this." His confession hit me like a punch to the chest, knocking the air from my lungs. I wanted to tell him that everything would get better, that these feelings would pass with time. But the truth was, I didn't know if they would. "We'll figure it out," I whispered, though the words felt hollow. "But for now, I think it's best if you go back to school early. We both need a little space to clear our heads." Leo's expression crumbled, but he gave a small nod. "Yeah," he whispered, "maybe you're right." For a moment we sat in silence, the weight of everything unspoken pressing down on us. I wanted to reach out, to hug him, to tell him that no matter what, I would always love him. That the space between us felt like a chasm, one that neither of us knew how to cross without falling. "Good night, Mom," Leo whispered, his voice barely audible. "Good night, sweetheart," I whispered back, watching as he slipped out of the room and closed the door behind him. As I lay back down, tears stung my eyes, and I knew that no matter how much space or time we put between us, things would never be the same again. Something had shifted between us, something neither of us knew how to undo. The next morning arrived too quickly, and the weight of everything unsaid between Leo and me hung heavy in the air. As I stood by the window watching the golden light spill across the garden, I heard the sound of Leo quietly moving around in his room, packing his things. It felt surreal, this decision to part ways to create the space we so desperately needed. Yet it was the only choice. He appeared at the bottom of the stairs, his duffel bag slung over one shoulder. For a moment he stood there in silence, as if unsure of what to say, just as I was unsure of how to see him off. This wasn't the casual goodbye we were used to, a mother bidding farewell to her son for another semester. It was different now, layered with complexity, regret, and an unspoken longing that we both knew could never be acknowledged. "Do you have everything?" I asked softly, my hands twisting in front of me. "Yeah," Leo answered, his voice low and subdued. "I think so." I wanted to hug him. I wanted to tell him that everything would be okay, that this was just a bump in the road, something that time and distance would smooth out. But those words felt hollow now. What had passed between us wasn't something that could be fixed with comforting clichés. Leo shifted awkwardly, glancing toward the door and then back at me. "I don't want you to think that I'm leaving because I don't want to be here," he said, his voice catching at the edges. I don't know what else to do." "I know," I whispered, the words barely escaping my throat. "It's the right thing to do. For both of us." The silence between us was thick with emotion, each second stretching longer than the last. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a precipice, trying to hold on to the last remnants of what had once been simple before the lines blurred, before things became complicated beyond repair. Leo took a step forward, hesitating for a moment before pulling me into a loose embrace. His arms were familiar and warm, but the embrace felt heavy, charged with emotions neither of us could name. I returned the hug, trying not to hold on too tightly, trying to remind myself that letting go was necessary, even though it felt like the most unnatural thing in the world. "I love you, Mom," Leo whispered into my hair. His voice was thick with emotion, and I felt his grip tighten for just a moment before he stepped back. "I love you too," I replied, my voice cracking. "Always." And with that, he turned and walked out the door, the sound of it closing behind him echoing through the now empty house. I stood there for a moment, frozen in place, listening to the sound of his car pulling out of the driveway and disappearing down the road. The house felt impossibly quiet after Leo left. Every sound, the ticking of the kitchen clock, the rustling of leaves outside, seemed amplified in the absence of his presence. I tried to distract myself with chores, but the ache in my chest lingered, a constant reminder of the complexity that now defined our relationship. Days passed, and though life returned to a semblance of normalcy, the house still felt emptier. I kept telling myself that this was for the best, that time apart would help us heal, that the distance would soften the sharp edges of what we had experienced. But deep down, I knew the truth. Some things once felt can never be unfelt. I missed Leo more than I wanted to admit. I missed the simplicity of the bond we once shared, the easy affection between mother and son, unclouded by confusion or longing. But I also knew that pretending things could go back to the way they were would only make things worse. In moments of stillness, I found myself replaying our conversations in my mind, wondering if I had handled things the right way. Could I have said something different? Could I have made things easier for him, for both of us? These thoughts haunted me, looping endlessly in my mind, but no matter how many times I revisited those moments, the outcome was always the same. There was no easy solution to what we had faced. Some relationships, no matter how well-intentioned, carry complexities that defy resolution. One evening, weeks after Leo's departure, I found myself sitting on the couch, the same one where everything had first shifted between us. The television was on, playing a movie I wasn't watching. I stared at the screen, lost in thought, when my phone buzzed beside me. It was a message from Leo. "Hey Mom, just wanted to check in. I miss you." A wave of emotions washed over me, grief, relief, and a strange kind of hope. I stared at the screen for a long moment, unsure of how to respond. But then, slowly, I typed out a reply. "I miss you too, sweetheart. I'm always here for you." And as I sent the message, I knew that things would never be simple between us again. But maybe, just maybe, that was okay. Some relationships aren't meant to fit neatly into predefined roles. Sometimes all we can do is navigate the gray areas as best we can, holding on to the love that remains, even when everything else feels uncertain. The road ahead was uncharted, and I didn't know what the future held for us. But for now, it was enough to know that we were both trying, that we were still connected, even from afar. Because love in all its forms is rarely simple, and maybe the hardest part isn't setting boundaries, but learning how to live within them.